we're not looking at things as they look in this world. It's like we're looking through a glass into another world. So I think the water is like Tempur-Pedic foam. And I think the other side can impress itself into the water and the camera can capture that.
Today's guest is Dr. Annette Childs. She has written a book about a really fascinating story where a close friend of hers sadly passed away from breast cancer, and her friend's husband, who nicknamed her God Woman, was as skeptical as me, probably more so.
And she was right at the end of her life, but I was so happy to get to complete my work with her. And I walked in and she looked at me and she said, "Where have you been?" And I said, "Oh, I was on bed rest." And I start rattling off why I was gone. And she said, "That's not what I mean. Where have you been?" And she just looked at me and she said, "You've been to the light." And she saw something in me that was one of those, it hit moments.
Dr. Childs holds a Ph.D. in psychology and for more than 30 years has maintained a private practice assisting individuals and families to grow through difficult transitions. As a researcher, she has extensively studied the near-death experience, and so now for my conversation with Dr. Annette Childs. If you want to learn how I went from being a skeptical atheist who thought there was zero chance of an afterlife to a skeptical atheist who thinks an afterlife is highly probable, come check out my books. WTF Just Happened. Hi everyone. Today I am speaking with therapist, death educator, and researcher, Dr. Annette Childs. Welcome.
Hi, Liz. Thanks for having me.
Hi, thanks so much for coming on. I am fascinated to talk with you. You do such interesting work. We're going to talk about, all the weird what the fucks and something to do with water types of mediumship. This is just going to be a fascinating conversation. So first, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about what you do now?
Well, historically, I am a therapist. I've been a grief therapist, and I have worked in the end-of-life field for, I hate to say it, but 40 years. And that's an honest number. I grew up in an environment where I was surrounded by elders who were leaving this world. So I had a very early interest in end of life. And I just followed that through from my early college education all the way through a doctorate degree. So I am a grief therapist. I'm a death educator. I'm a big believer in something I call death awareness, which is helping the dying to learn about some of the things you and I will be talking about today, because I have seen how profoundly that changes the dying process for them. And in turn, it changes the grieving process for their families that are left behind. I am an author. I've written quite a few books. Two of them are on after-death communications, specifically through a woman named Margaret Borwatt that I worked with in 2004 through 2006. And we'll get into that, but she's a large part of what I've written about.
Yeah, your story related to her is fascinating, but I'm going to back up a little bit. Did you always think there was an afterlife?
I think I did. Growing up on a ranch, I saw life and death around me all the time. The chicken that might be scratching around our ranch in the morning was dinner that night. I'm from a deeply multi-generational family where all of my elders we cared for at the end of their lives. So even as a kid, I was really aware of the organic nature of the dying process. But in particular, my grandmother, who was terminally ill, lived next door to me. And she was terminally ill for about a decade. And during that time, she had several near-death experiences. Of course, we didn't know that's what they were, and we didn't talk about them. And I say we, which I should be saying me, because the rest of my family was not in the front row of interest at looking at death and the afterlife like I was. I just was wired for it from a very young age.
If you want to finish what you were saying, if you'd like, but I also wanted to ask if you wanted to share anything about your grandmother's near-death experiences, any of the details.
Well, she didn't talk about them, but she was coded. She flatlined a number of times and came back. She never said anything about what happened to her, but she had a presence and a peace about her. Even as a little kid, I absolutely recognized there is something here that I want to know more about. And, for a kid, it's not real typical for a 10, 11, 12-year-old to want to be sitting with their 70, 80-year-old grandmother as much as I did. And I really feel like there was some kind of energetic resonance that I was really drawn to. So even though I wouldn't say that I conceptualized anything formal about an afterlife as a child, I was always clairaudient. I was always clairvoyant. I didn't know what that was, but I had very deep knowings. I had mystical experiences. One of the gifts of growing up on a ranch, I didn't have neighbors. I didn't have kids to play with. And I think that wires you much, much differently.
So what was the first, what I call what the fucks, clairaudient, clairvoyant kind of weird thing that happened to you?
Probably the first thing that was a what the fuck for my whole family, more so than me. I was raised Catholic, and my parents sent me to catechism, which is, schooling for children to learn the Catholic rites of passage. And they would give us these little workbooks. And across the front of my workbook, I had written, "What about reincarnation?" And that didn't go over very well with my teacher, who, of course, showed my little workbook to my parents. And they had no idea where I had gotten that concept. And, this was in the early 1970s. That was not, I didn't have access to information about reincarnation. There weren't shows like today. You couldn't Google or scroll through your social media feed to see it. So that is probably, I still have that book. And I was in, I believe, third grade when I did that. So that was kind of the first what the fuck for my whole family. Like, what is wrong with her? They really didn't understand. And I didn't really know where I got that question and how I knew to question that concept. So that's the earliest what the fuck that I can remember.
Did you just hear that word, or you don't even have any memory of how?
I don't. There was no way I could have heard it. I mean, I didn't have anyone around me who thought in those terms, and there weren't TV shows that I had access to. To this day, I have no idea where that came from.
That's kind of amazing. Wow.
It's interesting.
Yeah. And what was the first highly verified experience you had?
When my grandmother died when I was 16. And after she died, I started having dreams of her. And now I believe they were visitations, but at the time I didn't know what a visitation was. And, my family is very traditional, and these weren't things that I could talk about at the dinner table. But almost every night my grandmother would come to me in a dream, and this was in the days of Polaroid cameras. She would greet me, and she looked radiant and bright and beautiful and healthy. And she had a Polaroid camera with her. She would hand it to me, and she would say, "Take my picture." And in the dream or the visitation, I would put the camera up, I would take the picture, and I would pull it down, and I'd pull the picture out of it, and it would start to develop, and she would be there smiling, and I would look up to show it to her, and she would be gone. And I had that dream many, many times, and I had no idea what it meant. I still have a poem that I wrote about it at that time, trying to understand it. And I had just gotten my driver's license when my grandmother died, or maybe I got it a few months after. One of the very first things I did, there was a psychic fair at one of our malls, and I drove myself secretly to this psychic fair. I was so, so curious. And I was walking through this little fair, and I still remember it was card tables and, purple tablecloths and what is probably super cheesy things. And I was just kind of looking at who was there. And a woman motioned me over, and she said, I don't want your money. I just want you to know your grandmother is with you. And I want you to know the dreams that you're having about taking a picture of her, those are not dreams, those are visitations. And the message is, even though you can't see me, I'm still here. That absolutely blew my mind.
Wow. That's verified. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And was that the first time you really, or was there, I should ask, of the first time you really, really started to process that, what you were raised about belief in afterlife? I'm assuming from what you said, traditional Catholic of heaven and hell, that was not true. Is that when you first started to really think that, or?
I think I always thought that. I always had a very universal concept that went beyond my religion, but I realized in that moment, oh my gosh, the afterlife, not only is it real, but there's some kind of interaction between our world and that world. I had no idea that was possible. I didn't know anything about mediumship at that point. I did know about near-death experiences. I had started reading Raymond Moody's work as a teenager. So I knew about near-death experiences, but near-death experiences, they hint at an afterlife, that, the research that we have on that, but they're not really conceptualizing an afterlife. They're showing us what the first moments of death feel like subjectively to the person who's dying.
Do you have any thoughts then on what the difference is, what would happen much later for people who don't come back from a near-death experience and die? What do you think happens past that, if you have any thoughts on that?
I do have thoughts on it, actually. And if we can back up just a little bit, there's something called nearing death awareness. Have you ever heard that term?
Is that like terminal lucidity and when deathbed visions? So, okay, we can talk specifically about those too, but.
So I see nearing death awareness, the near-death experience, and after-death communications on a continuum. So if you imagine like the near-death experience is like a little ball of silly putty right here in the middle, and you can pull it on both ends way, way out. And we tend to focus, we like the little balls, we like that compact, boom, piece of information that we can hold on to, which is very finite, really. And you've probably figured that out even with your research. You get these giant hits of knowing, and then it starts to dissipate. You can't really hold on. You hold on to some of it, but we can't hold on to that hard little ball of truth. It immediately starts to dissipate in this world. At least that's what I've found, and I have found through my research. So I've learned in working with the dying, the grieving, and my clients, and in my own life, I'm constantly stretching that continuum to nearing death awareness. What most people don't realize, that can start years or decades before we die. I live my daily life in a complete state of nearing death awareness. I'm aware death is right here next to me every single day. And as a kid, I grew up next to my dying grandmother. I actually conceptualized, I knew death lived next door. And I decided really early I wanted to get to know it, because I realized it's a companion to all of us. I don't think it's the Grim Reaper. I don't think it's this dark hooded figure that shadows our life. I think it's a companion. We come in and it's right there next to us. So nearing death awareness, it's what I did my doctoral dissertation work on, and something I'm so passionate about teaching, not just the dying, but the living about. Because when we become aware that death is here with us, and we're willing to look at it, learn from it, speak with it, listen to it, the ways it changes the way we live are there. I can't quantify that. And I'm sure you have learned that in the last few years of your life. You can't put into words what happens when you invite death intimately into your life. And most of us won't do that until we have to, until we've lost someone that we can't bear to live without. And then suddenly, we're knocking on the door. We want to know death, and we want to know the afterlife, because that's where our loved one is. But if we learn to start that conversation, we don't have to start it through grief or through crisis. We can start it through a gentle curiosity. And the way that changes how we live our lives is just, it's at the heart of everything that I do.
And that's what your doctorate is on and was about. And that's what you studied, was how bringing this parallel living alongside death into your life changes everything. How would you, oh, sorry, go on.
It not only changes everything conceptually for us, it actually, I believe, magnetizes these very high level mystical experiences into our lives. The things that happen to me on not a daily basis, but a regular basis are uncanny. And at this point, the people around me just kind of shake their heads and laugh. They're like, well, that's just Annette. And then sometimes I get commentary from people, why are you special? And people will think there's an ego part of that. But in truth, I'm living on that edge. It's like I'm here on the edge of life, and I've got one hand, I've got a full life. I've got 3 kids and parents that I'm very close to, and a career. And I mean, my life here in the here and now is super busy, super regular, but I always have this other hand reaching over that cliff. And I get amazing rewards for that. It isn't that I'm special. It's not that I'm wired in a way that no one else is, but I do live on that edge. And because of that, I get these extraordinary experiences. Part of what I teach my clients is to live on that edge, because anybody can listen to my experiences or your experiences or anyone else's experience. But as you, I'm sure, have learned, that's kind of like spiritual junk food. Like, you can listen to my sacred stories today and you can ingest them and they'll light you up, but they won't hold you because they're mine. And as much as they nourish you in the moment, you have to find that sustenance in your own life that will keep you feeling satiated. And just like food, we have to keep nourishing ourselves. We can't just get one big hit of the sacred and then go on our merry way and not think about it and expect to be changed and transformed by that.
Now, you said you have these unbelievable things happen to you all the time. What is a recent one that just is, as I would say, inexplicable by normal means?
I'm a crier, so I'm going to get a tissue.
Love that.
Because this just happened in the last couple of weeks. So it's very fresh. I had a very, very dear friend named Bill, who, of all things, was a checker at my grocery store. And sometimes you just meet people that are a soul connection to you, and you know it. And I definitely have the ability to sense that. And this guy became a deeply ingrained soul friend to me, even though, if you looked at us from the outside, there should be no reason we would be good friends, but we were. And 9 years ago, I wrote a blog about him. And 9 years ago, I was writing a blog called RX for the Soul, and it was a daily blog that the night before it published, I would write whatever the universe gave me. So it was a real-time blog that documented spiritual experiences in daily life. So on August 11th of 2015, I was moved to write a blog about my friend Bill. Don't know why. I just wrote a beautiful blog, talked about what a wild card friend he was to me, put a picture of him. It was one of my favorite blogs I ever wrote. Just a really sweet tribute to this man. A couple weeks ago, Bill was murdered.
Oh, wow. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to hear that.
And I was watching the news, which I rarely watch. There was a fire in our area, so I had turned our local news on to watch that. And they said that someone had been murdered the night before, and they gave his name, and I just froze and thought, oh my God, no, it can't be you. And I knew before I even got into the archives of my computer, I absolutely knew that death had been speaking to me on the day I wrote that blog 9 years ago. And he was murdered on August 11th of 2024. And I wrote that blog on August 11th of 2015. That's nearing death awareness. And it's a double-edged sword, because people can hear things like that about me and think, oh my God, that woman is as dark as coal. How could she possibly have this connection? Things like that happen to me quite regularly, and I don't interpret that as dark. I look at that and I know Bill's angels were coming to me and saying, buckle your seatbelt, because on this day in the future, he's going to break your heart. But on this day today, you're honoring him. And his family has asked me to read my blog at his funeral, which is such an honor. But I know that will be perceived very different ways by very different people because of my connection to nearing death awareness. So when I say we've got that nice little hard ball of experience in the middle, when we learn to stretch it out, it is mind-blowing. It's a absolute what the fuck when these kind of things happen. So sorry for my tears.
No, that shows how much you love him. That was really, I'm so sorry, first of all. And I mean, I can link to your tribute to him, so people can read the blog post and learn a bit about who he is.
That would be lovely. He was just a golden soul.
Thank you for sharing. I think it's a really nice way we can all get to know who he is. Mm-hmm. One thing that stood out to me before we get into more of the questions I sent you is that you wrote this August 11th, 9 years to the day he was murdered. Now, what does that say about our choice in when we pass? You know, something like a disease that you could easily say is embedded in the body and maybe you can unconsciously pick that up. Something like an accident, murder, you know, that I'm sure some listeners have lost people in those ways. And there's a lot of, you know, God, just what if my loved one had left an hour later? What if they hadn't done XYZ? They'd still be here. But this almost seems like, I don't quite know what to say, like, for lack of a better word, destined? Or what are your thoughts on that?
You know, I have always felt like there is an interplay of fate, destiny, free will, and chance. And I'm a very visual person. I look at my own life like a chessboard. And I'm over here, and by the end of my life, I will be over there. And every day I choose which way to move. And no one forces me which way to go. And everything I do probably changes my destiny. I do believe we have multiple realities that we can live out. I'm not a huge believer that we are destined. Like, I'm not a believer that Bill was destined to have this happen to him. I do have a sense that Bill continued to live as the man I wrote about that day 9 years ago. I mean, he was an unusual human being. And it comforts me to know that the man I captured on August 11th, 9 years ago, ended up, I mean, he went into the light on that day 9 years later. As horrible and tragic as that is, there's some beauty in that, and there's some comfort in that for me.
Is there, before again we go on into some of the other questions, is there a specific memory or trait about him or something about him you would like to share with everyone?
He kind of looked like Buddha. He was just a larger than life guy. And he'd be checking groceries in the grocery store. And if I walked through the door, he would just bellow through the store, "Hey, babe, how are you?" And which used to really, it used to embarrass me a little bit. And I had written in my blog that the day before that, he had said, "Hey, babe, I love you." And instead of being embarrassed and being shy about it, I yelled, back, I love you too, Bill. And I'm so glad I wrote about that and captured it.
Thank you for sharing that. Now, you mentioned you wrote a book. I loved it. I think our audience, a lot who are somewhat skeptical like me, would really love it. There was character Don, who we can go into a little, who's I identify with in many ways. But first, let's back up. Tell us a little, who is Margaret and who is Don?
So Margaret Borwat was a woman who, she was watching a TV show one night. She was terminally ill, and she saw me on an interview and knew I lived in her hometown. So she called me the next day and asked if she could make an appointment with me. And she did. I welcomed her into my office. And she began telling me a little bit about her history. She had been a breast cancer survivor for many, many years, but had just received the news that she was terminal. She was brilliant. She lobbied before Congress. She was a researcher. She was a philanthropist. I can't say enough about who she was as a human. Kind of like Bill, she was exceptional. So as I got to know her a little bit that day in my office, I just point blank said, I don't want you to be my client. And she said, why not? Why don't you want me? And I said, I just want you to be my friend. I think you and I can do so much together to help people, but we can't do it in a closed, confidential room where nothing that goes on in this room can go out into the world. So let's take the client-therapist dynamic away and let's begin working together. And she wanted to learn how to die well. She knew she was going to die. And her and I started working on that. And I started sharing everything I had learned in. At that point, I had been in the end-of-life field for probably about 20 years. So her husband, Don, was as businesslike as she was philanthropic. And she, at some point in my relationship with her, she decided that what I was giving her, she wanted to get out to a bigger audience. She had many, many friends in the breast cancer world, and she wanted them to be able to get the same information she was getting from me. So she asked her husband to meet with us and he was a business consultant, to help get my work out into the world. And I will never forget, nor will he. I showed up to their home and he had a whiteboard and he had a legal pad and he was very businesslike. And I don't remember what I said, but he was horrified. He didn't want to work with me. He immediately nicknamed me the God Woman, which was not a compliment. He was being sarcastic. So never again did he call me Annette. To this day, he doesn't call me Annette. And he told Margaret, I can't do it. This woman is too full of foo-foo, and I don't do foo-foo. So that was how we first met. And I didn't really care for him either. He was a hard-nosed businessman, and I'm very soft-hearted and I'm not very businessy about what I do. So we had the mutual love of Margaret going for us. But other than that, it was kind of like a dog and a cat. We circled one another, but we really never got close to each other. I did not think he was very nice. He did not think I was very smart. So we didn't get close. And then Margaret got to the end of her life and she was in the hospital, and Don called me and he said, God Woman, Margaret wants to see you. She's in such a room. Will you come up here? So before leaving my house, I have a little altar that I keep, and I had a little bowl of stone hearts. And I grabbed a blue stone heart for Dawn and a white stone heart for Margaret, and I just put them in my pocket. Before I did that, I had said some prayers, and I have a story in my history about a stone in my life that had a profound impact on me. And Margaret knew about that stone, and it was very, very meaningful to her. So my prayer was, may this little stone heart bring Margaret the same comfort that the stone Madonna has always brought to me. So I brought my little stones up to the hospital, and Dawn was there with her. And I spoke with Margaret for a minute, and I gave her the little white stone heart, and I asked her to please hold on to it. And I told her that I trusted that she would be held by an invisible hand, just like she was holding that white stone heart. And it was a very heartfelt interaction between us. And she took the stone from me, and then I reached in my pocket and I gave the blue one to Dawn. And he wouldn't put his hand out. He just stood there. And I will never forget Margaret taking her rebreather mask down and saying, "Damn it, Dawn, it's a gift. Take it." And he was like, "All right." So he took the stone heart. So I didn't see Margaret after that, but she did tell me, the last thing she said to me was that she was going to help me from the other side when she got there, and that she was going to help the dying not be as afraid as she had been. And she was in that spot of nearing death awareness, and she was not afraid. So she was living what we had been talking about. And she was amazed at the peace that she had. So that was a promise that she made to me. And I didn't see her again after that. And unbeknownst to me, she did hold on to that little white rock. And anytime she would drop it and it would fall out of her hand, Dawn would hold it until she woke up. It was a little interplay that was going on between them that was very meaningful, that I didn't know anything about. So fast forward to Margaret died, and I live in Nevada. Dawn and Margaret were from New York. So when she died, Dawn made arrangements for her to be buried in New York. That's what she wanted. And unbeknownst to me, when she died, somehow that little white stone heart went missing. It had been in her hand, Dawn thought, when she died. And when he went to take it out of her hand, it wasn't there. And he searched the hospital. He looked everywhere that he could look, and he couldn't find it. And it was painful for him, because it had been something Margaret had really wanted to hold on to. But I didn't know anything about that. So a few weeks passed, and Margaret's funeral happened in New York. And I did not expect to hear from Don again, but I did. I got a phone call from him, and he was very terse. He said, "God, woman, I need to talk to you. Can you meet me for coffee? Something has happened, and I don't know what the hell to do." And he was not happy about it. And I immediately thought, oh my God, I wondered, did she not die peacefully? Did the things that I had told her about end up not bringing her comfort? I had all kinds of things going on in my head. But come to find out, as you read in the book, on the morning of Margaret's funeral, Don awoke in a hotel room, and he was getting dressed, and he said out loud, "How am I going to bury the girl I've loved since I was 14 years old?" And he turned to look at where she would have been if she had been with him in that hotel. And on the bed was the white stone heart, which when he told me that, I didn't know what to think of it. And honestly, I didn't know whether to believe it or not, this was not a man that I really liked. It certainly wasn't someone I trusted. I knew he didn't like me. I had never had something like this happen. I didn't have an answer for it. I was really intrigued at the fact that I wouldn't say he was angry, but he was very unsettled. And he didn't trust me either. I think he wondered, what did you do? How did you do this? This is your kind of stuff. This is not my world. This is your world, which I think he used those words with me. And he wanted me to make sense of it, which is why we began meeting for coffee weekly. Not that I could make sense of that experience. I couldn't, but I could kind of retroactively begin telling him all of the things that I had seen and experienced with the dying in my many years of work. So what started as kind of a forced conversation because we were both spinning from this happening and we didn't trust one another has turned into, this has been 18 years, and Don is a dear friend of mine. Now I trust him implicitly, as does he trust me, but we didn't get there easily. And after the White Stone Heart, I figured that was probably the end of the phenomenon that would happen to him. But it wasn't. He started having after-death communications from Margaret. And I write about them in Soul Messenger. And I helped him make sense of those. And he went kicking and screaming the whole way towards all of this. And to this day, he still will say on occasion that I ruined his life. Because I forced him to have a conscience. Not that he didn't have a conscience, because he was always a good person, but there's truth to that. And I often say this in my classes, when it really dawns on you that we don't die, after you're done saying, oh my God, that's awesome, the first thing you say is, oh, fuck. Like, we don't die. And which immediately gives you a conscience. It gives you responsibility. It takes these like little finite human lives that we can screw around in and misbehave in and not give a heck about things that we do and say. That kind of crumbles when you realize this is just a very small sliver of who we are, and everything we do comes with us as we move forward out of these bodies. It's the truth many of us want, but when we actually really realize it, it's pretty heavy.
Hey everyone! I'm really excited to let you know about the Science and Spirituality salons I'm now hosting. During these intimate events, a scientifically verified psychic medium will give all of you readings, and I will give a talk on the science and evidence that changed my mind about an afterlife. This will also be an amazing opportunity to get to meet some of you in person or virtually, and to share more about all the science and data that transformed my worldview and got me through my worst days. These can be hosted in your home, in a nearby cafe with a private room, or they can even be virtual. I've hosted a few already, and they were really special, fascinating, emotional, evidential. So if you're interested in getting a small group together over dinner, brunch, drinks, coffee, to learn more about the science and to get evidential medium readings, send me an email at hello@wtfjusthappened.net and put science and spirituality in the title. See, for me, it was so different. That was actually one of the things I wanted to ask you, because as I said, I related to Don, not in, maybe you described some of his kind of roughness up front. I don't think that, but my level of skepticism, I didn't think any of this was true, but it has been nothing but joy the more evidence I get. Every time something weird happens, I mean, I can't believe it. I'm like, did I dissociate and go plant this sign in my room and don't remember it, you know? But it's nothing but joy and hope. And for me, I guess I feel less pressure in this life thinking this is just a day in the big picture. Like, not that I don't have really big goals and want to have meaning. And in fact, the concept of having a meaningful life in terms of doing value for the world has never been more important to me. But I think that is almost more because I'm around so many parents who've lost kids who'd be about my age now, or a lot younger as well. But what do you think he wasn't just like, you know, me when something happens, I'm like, what the fuck? That's amazing. This is the best thing. Oh God, I don't want to lie to myself. I hope it's true. But yeah, you said he sort of, in a certain way, his life, you know, jokingly, he said he ruined my life, but there was a part of him that felt that. Now, and many, many skeptical people have that same experience and seem almost not wanting this to be true. I can't begin to understand that. Do you have thoughts on that, or is that what you just already explained, or?
What is your question? I'm sorry, I didn't.
Yeah, I guess I sort of said it in a roundabout way. Like, why do you think Dawn and many other skeptical people seem almost upset that there would be an afterlife instead of it being, and upset when weird things happen to them instead of it being the absolute best thing? Like, to me, this is better than if I won $1 trillion. Like, there is nothing better than this.
Well, I don't think Don was actually upset. He and I have a chemistry between us. He loves to banter. We really have a lot of fun with this. And at the end of the day, he's a very, very soft-hearted man who does a lot for the greater good, but he doesn't necessarily like the world to know that. So
okay.
I don't think he was not upset about it, but he was a really comfortable agnostic. Not that he didn't believe in an afterlife, but he didn't believe in this back and forth communication the way we have had with Margaret. He certainly didn't believe in that. And there has been a responsibility that has come for both of us that has not always been pleasant. There are times when we have been gifted with information, which, yes, it's a gift, but bringing that to someone who thinks you're full of crap, you're lying, you want money, you've photoshopped it, that's no fun. And that's one of the reasons I'm very small in the way I live my life around these concepts. I do write books, and when someone like you wants to speak with me on the topic, I'm thrilled to do it, but you will never find me out in the world beating my drum. I am pretty fragile as far as being out in the world, and the things that happen to me do not make sense to most people, and I do not like being accused of fraud or Photoshop, especially with the grieving, the dying, people who have lost children. It's a bitter pill to swallow that I don't willingly go towards those situations, nor does Dawn. But that doesn't seem to stop that other side from getting a hold of us when it wants to. And Dawn's a medium in his own right, as am I. But when he and I connect, it's ridiculous what happens. There is some kind of synergy between us. He's moved across the country, so I rarely to never see him in person now. And almost any time I text him or he texts me, phenomenon starts almost immediately, to which he loves to say, fucking leave me alone. I'm enjoying retirement. Don't do this to me.
Right. What's an example of a recent thing that happened with you guys that maybe is not in the book? The book, everyone definitely needs to read. It's filled with these, again, what I call what the fucks. It's really beautiful and funny and fascinating. So, and what are some of the things that happen now when you guys communicate?
We don't communicate that often anymore for that very reason, because it just starts a ball bouncing that we have to chase, and it's helpful to people grieving, but it's pretty disruptive in our daily lives. So one of the more recent ones, he sent me a text message. This was probably 2 years ago, so not real recent. And Dawn is the messenger. So if you picture a football game, Margaret is like the center who hikes the ball. I think it's a center. If I'm wrong, my kids and my husband will lecture me on this, but the football.
I have no idea. I'm the wrong one to ask.
Quarterback. Dawn's the quarterback. So Margaret is hiking the message to him, and then he's dropping back and he's finding the God woman, and I'm the receiver, and I get the message. And then it's my job to figure out, where do I go for the touchdown? So he never knows who these messages are about. And part of what you read about in Soul Messenger is this weird cross correspondence that we have. I am confidentially working with people in my office, and Dawn will pop through with information about them. Really very specific information about them, which is laughable when it comes to confidentiality and my life as a therapist. It just jumbles everything, which has made me create a consent form at this point. When I work with grieving people, I let them know they don't have to agree to it, of course. And if they don't, I don't interact with Dawn, but letting them know there's this third party activity that sometimes goes on, not always, but a lot of the time, that messages come through for people Dawn doesn't know. So this message I'm thinking of, and when Dawn gets messages, they're very cryptic. They're a little bit like, have you ever read any of the Nostradamus stuff?
I have not. No.
So
I know it exists. I kind of know a general idea of what it is, but I don't know much about it.
So when Nostradamus got messages, they weren't direct. It was never direct information. It was kind of poetry and parable, and it's really hard to figure out what he's talking about until you figure out what he's talking about. And then, oh my gosh, you can see what it is. So Dawn, and he typically either gets Dreamtime information and writes it on a legal pad that he keeps by the side of his bed, or there's a lot of strange ways that he gets his messages, which I won't go into. But this message that he got: there will be danger at the beach. It involves your friend Kay. It involves Home Depot and Nichols. And that's really typical of the kind of stuff he sends. And, he'll punctuate that with, I don't know what the fuck this means. You go figure it out. He's irritated. He's gotten the hike. He just threw the ball. Go for it, God woman. You go figure this out. I have no idea. And the number of text messages I have from Dawn where he says, I have no idea. And he really doesn't. So I get that message, have no idea what it could possibly mean. But I am traveling to San Diego that weekend for a soccer tournament with my son. And one of my good friends whose son is on the team, her name starts with a K. So immediately I'm thinking, oh my gosh, danger on the beach, okay. And it's not unusual for me to have a little bit of a sense of dread when these messages come through, because I don't know who they're for. Are they for my family? Are they for someone else? Am I supposed to intervene and stop something? Am I going to witness something? I mean, you really never know. So we go to San Diego. Things are fine. Soccer tournament's going fine. We go to the beach with this woman, Kay, and her family and my family one day. And I'm not thinking of that message. A few days has gone by. Everything's been fine. I'm relaxed about it. Well, we're sitting on the beach. All of a sudden, helicopters come and there's, Jeeps with sirens driving down the sand. And I immediately get up and my husband's like, "Where are you going?" And I was like, somebody's going to need my help down here. And I was thinking like maybe it was a shark attack. I didn't know, but immediately the message came back to me and I knew I had to get down there. So I sprint down the beach, and what had happened, a bluff had collapsed and it had killed a family and left two people in the family unharmed. And I walked up to the police officer that was there and I said, "I am a trauma therapist. Is there anyone I can help?" And he said, "Yes, please sit with this woman. Her whole family has just been wiped." So I immediately sit down and start speaking with this woman and start doing some, just some neurological stuff for trauma and talking to her and getting her through this. And they're trying to dig out her family, but there's no hope. The woman gave me her name and her cell phone number, and I gave her mine. And we went back to the hotel, and of course I was completely shaken. And I text Don and say, "Oh my God, it's starting to make sense." And he said, "What about the Home Depot and the Nichols?" And I was like, "I have no idea what the Home Depot and the Nichols was." And it took just a few minutes for me to figure it out. I was sitting on our hotel room bed, texting with Dawn, saying, "I don't know what this is about." And I look out the window and there's literally a Home Depot sign that I can see from our hotel, and I take a picture. I had said, "Oh my God, this is the hotel we're in." And then we're trying to figure out what are the Nichols. We couldn't figure that out. The next day, when I was paying our bill to leave the hotel, the address of the hotel was 555. I don't remember the street. So the information we get is really specific, even though it's very cryptic. And again, you can ask fate, destiny, what was going on there? And I have to be really careful with information like that. The woman that I helped on the beach that day, to this day, we are very close. And I have to say, this kind of work creates soul bonds that are really beyond this world. I can't really aptly describe them. But she, at this point, believes this was a destined event. The reason they were at the beach that day, the woman she was with was celebrating being done with chemotherapy for breast cancer, which is a huge tie-in with Margaret, and really made all of us believe Margaret was there to greet her and really was just pulling in support for her family, that this was going to happen one way or the other. And it made me wonder immediately, was her cancer not in remission? Was this a different way for her to go to the other side, that even though it was horrible for her family, was maybe not as brutal for her? And Was Margaret pulling in support for her family to help them see a bigger picture so that they could start to build meaning around this random, horrible event?
Right. Oof, that was beautiful, hard, powerful. Just, it's like
It's
all of
heavy
this.
stuff.
Yeah.
When I tell you Don and I don't interact with one
Mhm.
another that often, those are the kinds of things that happen. And I don't think death happens because Don and I are interacting. As you know, it happens. And it's going to happen to all of us at some point. But there is a way to build a container of the sacred around that to bring meaning to these random events for the people that can look at it that way.
Right. And now you mentioned you studied, I believe you said, correct me if I'm wrong, you did a dissertation on people like me and Dawn, people who aren't officially mediums. I don't really consider myself someone who has much
Mhm.
abilities. I've always been skeptical. Yet, when we start studying all of this and surrounding ourselves with researchers and mediums and near death experiencers, we start having experiences as well. And can you elaborate on your thoughts, how that works? Any thoughts? I don't even, almost even don't know what questions to ask. Just how, why, what do you think?
So one of the ways I think that happens, and I think you're absolutely correct, when we start moving in circles of energy that reflect the kinds of things we're talking about today, we start to pick up that energy. Couple different ways that I look at that. One, have you ever heard of Rupert Sheldrake? He is a scientist.
Yes.
He talks
Morphic.
about morphic fields, which are fields of energy that build around us and they get bigger and stronger the more that we populate them with similar energies. And when we see schools of fish that, thousands of fish that are moving in unison and they never run into each other and they can defy predators because they're able to look like one big fish, that's, to me, that's a morphic field. And birds are able to do the same thing. When you're moving, like at the IONS conference, when you're moving with other people in a field, you can move forward much easier because you have the energy of this group around you. It isn't just Liz trying to elbow her way through energy to get to the other side. When we're in a field of people all looking in that direction, it makes it so much easier to move forward. And we don't have to be at a conference. We don't have to be in a big group of people. We've all heard the biblical saying, when two or more are gathered. There's a lot of truth to that. Anytime that we are looking in the same direction, even with just one other person, it's exponential how much that can help us move forward towards that direction that we're looking.
And I'm sorry, what is that saying? I don't know if everyone has heard it. I have not
Well,
heard that
because
biblical.
I grew up hearing
Well,
it.
okay.
Where two or more are gathered, um, I don't have it memorized
Oh.
to its fullness, but basically that's where you will find the presence of the divine. When two or more are gathered, focused on that, that's all it takes. And I think that's a biblical saying. I'm not a very good historian, and I'm not I'm not very good at my religious sayings, but I think that reflects what we're talking about.
Thank you.
And then
Okay.
in my doctoral dissertation, the direction I went, are you familiar with Kenneth Ring?
Yes, very. But we should tell our listeners about some of his near death experience research. It's
Yeah, he's
amazing.
done a ton of research on the after effects to near death experiences, which have not changed much in the many years that we've been studying this. And I don't have them all memorized, but people become less religious, more spiritual. They become more intuitive. They become more philanthropic. They tend to recycle more than they did before their experience. They become more aware of the environment. They become much less interested in money and way more interested in meaning. There's all kinds of documentable, verifiable changes that happen after a near-death experience. And he has done a wonderful job in documenting those. I think his book is called Lessons from the Light.
Oh, I have to read that one. I know his one, Mind Sight. He did studies of blind people who were able to see and get verified information during near-death experiences, which is a whole other conversation. Yeah. But I didn't know he also wrote about the emotional after effects. That's okay. I'm going to have to read that.
It's emotional, but it's also like constitutional. It changes your character. It seems to change your body energy. People who've had an NDE have a hard time with wristwatches. Their computers don't run great. Copy machines don't function right in their presence. And the way that I got interested in these after effects, when I was pregnant with my second child, I was in preterm labor and I was given a medication that made my blood pressure plummet and my heart rate go way down. And I was not resuscitated, so I did not have a classic near-death experience, but I had an out-of-body experience. I met with a being of light. I had many of the classic near-death experience type things happen to me, but I wasn't technically dying. That changed me profoundly after that, which I knew. But I was working at hospice at the time, and I had, because I was on bed rest, I think I had taken at least 3 or 4 months away from work. So when I finally safely delivered my child, I went back to work, and I only had one patient who was still alive. And she was right at the end of her life, but I was so happy to get to complete my work with her. And I walked in, and she looked at me and she said, "Where have you been?" And I said, "Oh, I was on bed rest." And I start rattling off why I was gone. And she said, "That's not what I mean. Where have you been?" And she just looked at me and she said, "You've been to the light." And she saw something in me that was one of those what the fuck moments.
Yeah, that's huge. Yeah. You touch upon that in your book, don't you? I feel like, yeah.
And it changed my work with the dying. I swore from that time forward, my rapport with the dying completely changed. It was like they could sense something in me that really helped us build a rapport much quicker. And it helped me understand them much better. I didn't have fear of where they were going. I felt like I had peeked through the door a little bit. And that's what prompted me to get my PhD. This had changed my life so much. I wanted to figure out, A, what had happened to me and would it happen to other people as well. So I started studying near-death-like experiences. So I started finding people who had had experiences similar to mine where they didn't physically die, but maybe almost died. And then I stretched it out to people who had after-death communications, people who'd had mystical experiences. And what I found in my research is those same changes do happen with other lower level, I would call them mystical experiences. And, you know, I would bet for you, you've had a lot of those same changes happen to you because of your research, because that's what happens. And Ken Ring calls it the benign virus philosophy. And he postulates that even being subjected to information about these things, going to a class, reading a book, that puts us one step further on that continuum towards the light. And our life reflects it. And I feel like once we take that step, it's impossible to go back. Once you feel the light, see the light, sense the light, I don't think you can unsense it. It's in you then. So I think once you step forward and you start to sense the light, see the light, hear the light, feel the light, you can't undo any of that, but it begins, it changes you. On some level, it transforms you. And I think one of the reasons I have magnetized these experiences that are, just these WTF experiences on a regular basis, I have been dipping my foot into the light since I was a kid. And at this point, I've got a whole lot of that virus in me. And because of that, things permeate my field pretty easily. I think anybody could do that. But again, it requires living on that edge. You can't sit here as a skeptic with your arms crossed and your legs crossed in your safe little academic or logical world and get those things. And I have plenty of grieving people who come to me that are just like that. They are one little compact unit of sorrow, anger, rage, disbelief. And I have found if I do a mediumship reading for them and I bring through something amazing, it rolls off them just like Teflon. Well, why would he say that? But it's very specific. How could that information have come through if it's not your loved one? But why would they give you that piece of information? I wasn't looking for that. I mean, they'll just build a nice wooden box around any message that you give them if they haven't somehow been kind of like vaccinated with the light a little bit.
Have you had any patients like that who transformed and they had maybe experiences such as deathbed visions, which is when people see deceased loved ones or, maybe going out in and out of body, other side, this side, which apparently, I mean, you would know more, but are there any stories of someone who was like that and had something happen towards the end of their life and they changed?
Yes, I had a young man I was working with who had a brain tumor, and we were about the same age. We had kids the same age. And I started working with him, and the minute I walked into his home, he was angry. He didn't want to see me. He didn't want to be dying. He didn't want to hear anything I had to say. He was furious that I was his age. I was going home to my kids, eating dinner every night. He was laying in bed on oxygen. It was a really tough rapport, and I completely understood why I caused a lot of pain to him. But he would invite me back every week. And his wife would always walk me to the door and she'd say, I'm sorry. He's so mad at you, but he does want you to come back. I'm sorry, that when you get here, he acts like this. So week after week, I would visit with him, and I was trying to teach him about near-death experiences. And, when people die, this is what they tell us, that they float out of their body, that they move through a tunnel, that they see deceased friends, relatives, pets, sometimes deities. And he would listen for a few minutes and then he'd say, just get the hell out of here. I don't want to hear this bullshit. He was mad. So I'd leave. Next week I'd come back and I'd get this much more information out. So one day I write about this in Soul Messengers. I was at a drive-through. I was at Long John Silver's of all places. Perfect place for a hospice worker to be eating lunch. Go figure. Like how to not elongate your life. Eat at Long John Silver's.
Right. You got to treat yourself sometimes to things,
So I was in that drive-through, and this was long before cell phones. So I had a little pager, and my pager goes off, and I can see that it's the office calling me. So I get through the drive-through, and then I get to a payphone and call the office, and they said it's so-and-so. He appears to be actively dying, and he is screaming for you to get the hell over there, which it terrified me because I thought, oh God, all the things I've been telling him must not be happening, and he is going to rip me a new one. So I went over there, and I get to his bedside, and sure enough, it looks like he is actively dying. And I take his hand, and I very quietly say, very tentatively, it's Annette. You wanted to see me. And he opened his eyes and looked at me, and little smile, and said, "Don't you know Long John Silver's will kill you?"
Wow.
To which his wife started crying because she's like, I don't know what is happening. I don't know why he's so confused. I was just stunned, absolutely stunned. One of the most proving things that ever happened to me as a hospice worker. He did not die that day, and he continued to have out-of-body knowings with his wife. After that, she was picking out, I don't know if it was an urn or a coffin, but she was doing what she had to do in preparation for his death. And he told her which one he liked. Of course, he had no idea she was doing that. And then at one point, he told her that he was upstairs measuring the windows to their bedroom. And he was telling her what the dimensions of the window were. And she went up and checked it at some point, and he was correct, which was his way of showing that even though his body was in that hospital bed downstairs, some part of his consciousness was able to be in a separate place.
I still get chills hearing these stories. However long you research it and hear so many, I still get, just these I still respond with what the fuck,
I never lose my sense of wonder, and I hope I never do. Yeah. Never. I'm always, every time those things happen, I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe that just happened, which is another part of one of the things I believe. I think these really high level spiritual experiences, that's what I call what we're talking about today. They're kind of like wisps of smoke. You see them, but I cannot grasp them and stick them in my bag so that I can say, hey, Liz, look what I got. Or I can't a week later look into my bag and say, look, I have this wisp of smoke. They're transient, which is part of what makes them sacred. They're not of this world. So we can't capture them, which is part of what keeps me with my feet on that path every single day. And why I say, there's spiritual fast food, and then there's learning to nourish yourself with these experiences. Some of them are huge, some of them are small. One thing I sometimes notice with the grieving, when they want proof of the afterlife or they want a message, I call it the fire hose from the universe. They want the fire hose of water hitting them and just knocking them off their feet with proof. I have not had the experience of that happening. Sometimes I get knocked off my feet. It's few and far between. And in place of that fire hose is one of those you know, those old sprinklers that are like kind of shaped like a little rainbow, and they've got like 30 streams of water that just slowly go back and forth. To me, that's how these messages come. They're not just in one place. They're here and here and here and here and here, and they're not knocking me over. But if I'm smart enough to know, I live with this little sacred cup, this invisible cup in my hand. And if I always have it out, I'm going to catch some of those streams of water every single day. And sometimes there'll be so much that'll be overflowing my cup. Other days, there'll just be a drop or two. But those things become part of me. But every day, it's up to me to keep that cup out. And I don't know where it's going to come from. I don't know how, and I don't know who. But I know if I have my cup out, something will fill that cup, a little bit or a lot that day.
And now, speaking of water, what you do water mediumship, and what is this? Because you'd sent me images related to it, and I misunderstood and thought it was a form of spirit art of like watercolors and digital photography and digital editing, but it's something completely different. So they're beautiful photos, absolutely beautiful. What exactly is water mediumship?
Well, that is a very good question. I don't know where I learned this. I do remember the first time I did it, and it was shortly after Margaret died, which is interesting. I had a cat that I loved that disappeared, and I was going every day to the Humane Society and looking for this cat, and I was putting posters up, and I had a reward for this cat. I was spending a lot of time trying to find my kitty. And like I say, I don't know under what circumstance I did this, but I took a picture of a bowl of water. And I was learning about physical mediumship at that point. So I think I must have read something about images coming through in water. So I took some pictures with my iPhone. And when I went back and looked at them, my cat was in the water, clear as day. And I was not looking, I was not expecting anything. This was absolutely I wonder what will happen if I take pictures of the water. This was a tabby cat that had like a white mark on his chest. This picture, it was my cat sitting there in the water. And as soon as I saw it, I knew he's gone. He's on the other side. And I never again went to the Humane Society. I took down my posters. And I was really perplexed at how that had happened. After that, I had a water fountain in my office, one of those little slate stone water fountains. And I started experimenting with water images with the grieving. And the second time it happened, interestingly enough, again, was with an animal, which was not what I was expecting. But a client that I'd been working with grief came in, and she had her dog with her because she was going to have him put down after our appointment. Really old dog. And the dog had been her husband's best friend, and her husband had recently passed. So she brought the dog with her just because she wanted to be in an energy of comfort and spirituality before she took him to get him put down. So we worked with the dog that day, and I said, let's use my water fountain. I'm going to use my phone, and let's see if your husband can show us that he's going to be there to greet your dog when your dog passes over. And I took some pictures and went and looked through the pictures, and there was no image of her husband, but there was a really astoundingly clear picture of an Airedale Terrier that was like, I'll send you the picture. It's uncanny. And I said to her, oh my God, what does an Airedale Terrier have to do with this? I think her dog was a Dachshund. It was not an Airedale Terrier. It was a little dog. And she looked at the picture and just burst into tears and said, oh my God, that's our dog that died 2 years ago. That was his best friend. That was just another WTF moment. There was no way I could have created that in any way, shape, or form. It was information I didn't know and was not at all what I was looking for or expecting. So that was my second instance of water mediumship. And since then, it's something that I don't always do, but when I do, I would say at least 75% of the time, very clear, super unexpected, very evidential images show up in the water, and it's moving water. So I've learned to use an aluminum bowl, and I either use a spoon or my hand to make the water move. And then I'll just hold my phone above it, and I do it in a sacred way. I say prayers. I ask, for help from the other side. I ask for any images that can be helpful for the grieving to come through. And some of the images that have come through are just really uncanny. So this first one that we will look at, this was a reading that I did. There was someone who was going into surgery and was not expected to live. And I was asking whether this person lived or went to the other side, what guardians does this person have around them that will help them through this experience? And I took my pictures, and this was a family member that I was asking about. So when I looked at the pictures, what I immediately saw was a picture of one of my relatives who passed probably 30 years ago, who was very, very close to the person who was going into surgery. And what often seems to be the case with my water mediumship, when a really clear image comes through, it matches a photograph that the family has. So you can actually hold the photograph up to the image in the water and you can see the two things. But I'm never privy to these photographs beforehand. This time I recognized the picture because it was a picture of my relative from 30 years ago that I know very, very well. But I didn't have that picture in my home. I didn't have it anywhere. I had to go get it from a family member. So in this picture, you can see the picture of the loved one, and then you can see the image in the water where you can see her dark hair. You can see how it's framing her face. You can see the lace collar, and most of all, you can see a corsage that she was wearing, which was a white flower with green leaves. Now, it's not always as easy for others to see the images as it is for me, but I have learned, I call them soft eyes. I've learned how to look at things where I can see the soft edges of things a little easier than people that are looking for, we're not looking at things as they look in this world. It's like we're looking through a glass into another world. So there is some distortion and there's a blurring of the edges of things, but the images are definitely there.
How would you guess it works? Do you think the discarnate energies of the animals or loved ones are making these images? Do you think you as a psychic medium are getting the downloads in some way, and it's PK, which is, psychokinesis, mind's ability to affect matter, and you're imprinting it? Do you have any insights in how this might work?
Yeah, I have a very simplified way of thinking about it in my own mind. I think the water is like Tempur-Pedic foam, and I think the other side can impress itself into the water, and the camera can capture that. And that notion comes to me from having been with physical mediums. Stuart Alexander is a dear friend of mine, and I have sat with him quite a few times in physical mediumship circles, and I've experienced ectoplasm, and I've experienced how forms and faces and images seem to get under ectoplasm and can then make themselves visible in this world. So I think water is probably kind of like ectoplasm in my world. It's something that I have a good relationship with, and the other side is able to impress itself upon the water. So I don't know if I'm correct, but that is how I look at it.
So I want to ask you a little more about physical mediumship and Stuart Alexander. I am fascinated by physical mediumship. As far as I know, I have yet to see it. Maybe some weird signs I've gotten are a form of it. I've gone to seances that were very clearly fake once I delved in. But yeah, I mean, I've read, heard about Stuart Alexander. Researchers are blown away by him. So he's genuine from what you conclude in that, right? Which is so encouraging to hear.
Absolutely. And, Stuart is one of the kindest, most humble, most intentional, integrity-filled human beings I've ever met. We met, and we were just instantly bonded. And oddly enough, I had learned about his work. I'm not sure. Oh, through the skull experiments. I had read that book. So I ordered his book on Amazon, and I can't remember. Somehow Stuart ended up contacting me. There's some logical way this happened, and I don't remember what it was right now, but he had just experienced the loss of his sister. And even though Stuart is a world-class medium, he was deeply grieving the loss of his sister. And he knew I had some mediumship tendencies, and he asked me if I would try and get a message from her, to which I thought, oh shit, like I am not.
No pressure. It's only Stuart Alexander.
And I didn't really realize at that point how renowned he was. And I didn't know much about physical mediumship. I was still super skeptical about it. But typically, if someone comes to me in sincerity and asks me for help, I will do my level best to give them their help. So I said, I will try. And after that, I sat down, and I don't, I guess I am a mental medium, but I don't do this often. I asked for direct messages from his sister, and what I got was really strange and really specific. She showed me a snake in a bucket, and I immediately thought, Jesus, really? Do I have to get back in touch with this medium and give him this bizarre message about a snake in a bucket? But I did. I try not to gatekeep. So I told him that she was showing me a snake in a bucket, and she was laughing hysterically. And I didn't know if this was real, if this was a brain fart, if I was making things up, but this is what I got. Well, that ended up really being life-changing for Stuart. And when he was a child, he and his sister had caught a snake in the garden, and they had put it in a paint tin and poked holes in the top. And they were terrified of this snake, but they wanted to try and keep it as a pet. So every day they would drop maggots into the top of the bucket so that they could feed the snake until they figured out where else to put it. So they did this for a few days, finally figured out what they wanted to do with the snake, and opened up the top of the bucket to transfer the snake to its new home. And lo and behold, the maggots had eaten the snake, which was horrifying to them as kids. But as adults, they thought it was hysterical, because here they are holding these maggots and dropping them in the bucket, not afraid of the bucket, terrified of the snake. And the maggots had ended up killing the snake. So it was very funny to them as adults. So my message about a snake in a bucket was just profoundly meaningful to him. And there's two things that really stick out to me about this. One, my innocence. I wandered into this interaction with Stuart so naive and innocent about any of this, and I had nothing to lose, so I gave it a shot. I sent him the information and I let it go. There was apparently great magic in that. I do believe when there's high need, the other side can come through much more strongly. And, I think, and even Stuart says, because I was an American lady, I didn't know him. He didn't know me. He had access to amazing mediums in the UK. And I don't know if he hadn't had readings with them or if he hadn't been able to sink into trust. The innocence of how we came to be and how that message came through was really, really healing for him. And then the second thing, just because Stuart is a medium and knows the other side is real, it doesn't take grief away. It just doesn't. No matter how much we know about the afterlife, grief is a human response to loss, and there is no way to get away from that.
I remember studying this early on and thinking there'd be a tipping point of evidence where I would no longer feel grief, and that I've gotten massive evidence, and I'm still pummeled by grief when I lose loved ones.
I
want to ask. Sorry.
We need our own sacred hits from the other side to really, it's like needle and thread. We need those really personal hits from the other side to really start to close up those wounds. And it, at least for me, it typically doesn't come through someone else. It doesn't come through a medium.
I do want to ask you, if you're okay, a little more about Stuart Alexander, because from what I've read, his phenomena is just, it's unbelievable. It's the most mind-blowing. And every person who has ever met him, tough researchers to sitters who've known him forever, say the same thing, that he is the kindest, most genuine, honest person. And everything I've heard about him, it's almost like going back to my first days of learning about mediumship. If this is true, this is the most mind-blowing, profound. I again, not even having words. And so what is the most, a little bit of the phenomenon, I think all of it is absolutely mind-blowing, that you saw Stuart Alexander perform at a seance, or perform's probably the wrong word, but manifest or do at his seance?
Oh gosh, I saw it all. I saw physical forms, voices, things moving around the room, mind through matter, where he moves things through solid objects. He did bring through information that there, and it isn't him, it's his spirit team. So physical mediumship is just a completely different thing than anything that we experience here in the West. Probably, I'll get emotional again, the most meaningful thing that happened for me was what I was told by the other side. And what his spirit team expressed to me was so much gratitude for the work that I was doing, and that I really didn't realize how much I was helping people just by the individual experiences that I was having and promoting. And they said things like there were so many people from the other side that I had helped, crowding the room, that just wanted to say thank you. So that, that's not very evidential, and it's very personal, but it meant so much to me, mostly because I so believe in the truth of Stuart Alexander. I didn't feel like that was something that was being said to make me feel good. It felt very genuine, and that's why I do the work that I do. So hearing that was it really moved me.
Thank you for sharing that. Getting moving messages is important too,
Yeah.
So thank you. Is there anything you want to share? Actually, I know one thing I should definitely ask. Do you have any tips for people in really that deep early grief where you just feel you can't go on? Or maybe someone who was recently given a terminal diagnosis. Any tips you want to give to any listeners in those positions?
I would say the same two things for both the grieving and the dying, that education, learning about the things that we're talking about, that's like the drop in the pond that begins the rippling out process that ends up being a container that holds your grief, it holds your loss, it holds the end of life, it holds the end of life for those that you love. We really have to build a container in our lives to hold the invisible. And to me, the afterlife is just one part of a much larger web of what I call the interactive universe. And once you really begin to experience the fact that there are these invisible energies that are just as real as, this desk that I'm knocking on, and that we are all connected. Like, I can't yank on one of my strings without making movement in your world now, nor can you yank on one of your strings without making movement in my world. We are connected, and everybody that we interact with and every experience that we have becomes part of a web that we live in. And when we really start to learn the truth of that web becomes like a blanket that we can swaddle ourselves in when the storms come, because they come. It doesn't matter how good we are, how carefully we live, how much we try and protect ourselves. There will be experiences where life will strip us of all of that. But if we've lived our life kind of weaving this web, we can bundle ourselves back up, and we can move with warmth and with grace through the world, no matter what comes our way. And I really feel like education and exposure are the beginning of that.
If you want to learn how I went from being a skeptical atheist who thought there was zero chance of an afterlife to a skeptical atheist who thinks an afterlife is highly probable, come check out my books. WTF Just Happened. So thank you. Where can our listeners find you, follow you, get your books? In terms of your services, are you available for medium readings as well, or mainly end of life care? What types of services would our listeners reach out to you for?
So I am available for both, but I typically don't do just mediumship. readings. I find that meeting someone, trying to do a mediumship reading with them, that's a very narrow scope. Sometimes it goes well. A lot of times it doesn't go as well as I would like. I am a big fan of sinking into a relationship, a teaching relationship, a therapy relationship where we start to build a container. It's not a quick process. And if you go to someone, I feel strongly about this, who says that, it is a quick process, and no matter who you've lost, they can connect with them and they can bring you messages. That does happen, but there's a whole lot of weaving that should go on, I believe, between a medium and a sitter in order for really good evidential quality messages to come through. And I don't think the grieving typically hold the bar high enough, because when we're grieving, we just want anything. And there's a lot that can be said that is not evidential. I'm never happy if I don't get really evidential information, because then I know I have done my job. And sometimes I can't do my job. There's not a connection. Just like, maybe you and I don't have a rapport. The interview's not going to go really well. That's just how it is. We have to assume that same thing has to occur between a medium, a sitter, and whoever's on the other side. Sometimes there's going to be a really nice flow of energy. Sometimes it's not going to be so great. But that doesn't mean there's no other side also. Like, if that's happened to you as a griever, don't give up. Keep looking, because the more you look, the more you build that field that is going to attract those higher level experiences in. But, use discretion in who you look for.
Thank you. And now, where can they find you and your books?
My website is rxforthesoul.com. So rxforthesoul.com. And you can also find my books on Amazon. Soul Messengers is on Audible. I think that's a great way to listen or to experience the book. And there's a contact form on my website if someone is interested in creating a relationship where we can begin to build that field.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate having you on.
Thank you. Love your work, and I appreciate your books and your skepticism. It's a good thing.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate your patience with my skepticism, and I love your work and books as well. To get more information on what the fuck just happened, go to wtfjusthappened.net. There you can order my book, WTF Just Happened, A Sciencey Skeptic Explores Grief, Healing, and Evidence of an Afterlife. You can learn all about how I came to conclude that there most likely is an afterlife, but you can also learn about the early stages of my grief and the amazing, fascinating people I met along the way. You can read about how much I harassed the mediums and scientists trying to get evidence to see if the mediums were cheating and see if what everyone was saying actually was true. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated on any new developments and any interesting new what the fuck updates. So if you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. It makes such a difference, especially for a new podcast like this one. And if any of you have had a crazy what the fuck yourself, have any questions, feedback, or just want to say hey, reach out on either Instagram at WTF_just_happened_, or email me at hello@WTFjusthappened.net. I love hearing from all of you. It makes my day hearing your stories and questions and feedback and all of it. And remember, you don't have to draw any final conclusions as you wonder, what the fuck just happened?